Hey folks, Andy here, thanks for joining me. Right, this time out we're going to take a look at setting the action on a guitar. Now action is the height of the strings above the frets. Notice that it's above the frets, not above the fingerboard, because when you press the string down, it's when it touches the fret that you get your note created. Action is typically quite easy to adjust, but it's also really easy to get wrong. I've seen so many guitars that have been set up wildly wrongly for the player, and that for the player bit is really important. Got to start off by saying that action is tied in very closely with neck relief with the truss rod adjustment that we covered in the last video. So if you're not sure about that, it might be worth going and having a look at that now. Right, it's easy to mess up your guitar by getting the action wrong, and it's kind of difficult in a sense because if you don't know what you like, then you don't know where your starting point is going to be. So if you've got a guitar that maybe you've put together or that's just not playing right for you at all, do the usual, go to the manufacturer's website, get the spec sheet and adjust to what the spec sheet says, and then adjust for yourself from there. Why might you want to move away from what the spec says? Well, a couple of things. Low actions typically feel fast and easy to play. You don't have to push the string down very far to get it to the fret. And if you've got fast hands and a fast brain, then it will help you if you want to be playing fast stuff like 3-note per string scales up and down the neck. If you want to be playing sweeps, that sort of stuff, it's a lot easier when you've not got to be putting a lot of movement into creating each note. The downside of it is that you're more likely to get rattles and buzzes from strings hitting against frets on the fingerboard. If your fretwork isn't the best, then low actions are a little bit demanding of fretwork. So you may find things like you will fret a note but hear a higher note because either the fret you're playing is low or there's a higher fret which is a little bit high, and as the string's going down pressing against it, it's actually fretting out. You may find if you've got an older style guitar with a vintage curvature neck that when you bend strings, as you're bending into the curve of the neck, that you're getting choking occurring, and maybe you find that you can only bend a semitone instead of a tone or a minor third or something like that. If you've got really low frets, you might find that same thing happening. You may find as you're trying to bend strings that you don't actually have enough room to get your finger underneath to get a good push on the string to guide it along the curve of the fingerboard rather than kind of pushing down onto it and digging in with it. So all of those things can make a difference. If you're hitting chords hard, you may find that you want a slightly higher action. Like I say, if you're shredding, you may want a lower action. It's one of those things that you are going to have to play it and decide for yourself. Nobody can really help you too much with that. But you know what? The manufacturer's spec is usually going to be a pretty decent place to start. Right. When we come to making these adjustments, you have got a couple of different types of bridge. Well, you've got more than a couple of different types of bridge, but you've got a couple of bridge topologies that are going to make a difference to you. One is if you've got something like a Les Paul or the SG, you've got a bridge which has got a curve to it. The curve will roughly follow the shape of the fingerboard, so you can raise the low string, the high string, and all of the other strings will just simply move in the same sort of curve. You don't have too much to worry about, but then you don't have too much adjustability if you need to make a slight adjustment on one particular string. If your saddles are worn, you may have to replace them so that you maintain your curvature. On something like the Strat, where you've got an independent adjustment on each saddle, you actually have to set the action and make sure that the curvature follows the way you want it to on the fingerboard. Now, it's not always the case that you want the curve to be exactly the same. I find on my Strat, for instance, that bending the second and third strings is so easy. My fingers and my string gauge are just used to each other, and bending there is really, really easy. But if I want to do a big bend, say a 3-fret bend on the first string, I sometimes struggle a little tiny bit with that because as I'm at the edge of the fingerboard, I find it hard to actually get my fingers underneath the string enough. So I will typically set the action on my high E string just a tiny little bit higher than you would expect from the other strings, just to give me a little bit more sort of room to get underneath. As I dabble in slide as well, that's quite handy for not cracking strings against frets when I'm playing, because I use the same guitar for slide and for normal play. So all of these things that are independent and individual to me and that are independent and individual to you will make a difference on how you set stuff up. Let's have a little look at the mechanics of it. So let's take a look at getting the action sorted out on this. And the first thing that we're going to do is tune it. And the reason that we're going to tune it is because, as we saw in the previous video, the tension in the strings affects the lie of the neck because of the tension balancing out the truss rod. And if it's out of tune, we're not going to have the right degree of relief in the neck. And that means that any measurements that we make on action are going to be compromised. So first off, a quick tune up. Okay, I'm going to say that that is in tune now, and the measurements that we're going to take are, we're going to measure the height at the nut on the bass and treble strings, and we are going to measure the action at the 12th fret on the bass and treble strings. And the reason for measuring those is they're the ones that I have got Gibson's figures for. Right, so for checking the nut height, I don't actually have the spec for the distance between the fingerboard and the string, and that would be kind of difficult to use anyway because you don't know what height your frets have ended up being. So what we're going to do first off is measure the first fret height. Now obviously this is going to be affected by how high the bridge is set, but it will give us a pretty good indication. So these things are always given, or always to be given, in 64th of an inch. So this rule is graduated in 30 seconds, which means that I can kind of measure down to a 64th, and really hard to see whilst I'm holding it. So there is where you're going to do your measurement, and I will have a look when I'm not trying to hold the camera on it and see what that comes down to. So the target, or the sort of standard heights that Gibson give us, are for the first fret for the bass string, for the 6th string, is 2/64ths or 1/32. For the high E string, it is 1/64th or half a 32nd, and the same measurement taken at the 12th fret for the bass string is 5/64ths, which is 2.5 32nds, and for the high E string it is 3/64ths or 1.5 32nds. So okay, the nut height is pretty good on this one. It's possibly a tiny little bit low on the high E, but it feels absolutely fine. And because we're doing player setup stuff here, I am really not going to get into cutting nut slots. I'll do that as a separate thing if anybody's interested in seeing it. So I'm going to say that the nut is okay. The action down at the 12th fret, there's the 12th fret, is round about bang on the low E string, and it is possibly a tiny bit high on the high E string. Personally, I would play this guitar as it is, and after I've got a few hours on it, I would just see how I feel about it. But let's just sort of go with the concept that we want to, that we're going to make a change on doing this. So first of all, let's have a look at what the bridge setup is like on this. So traditional Les Paul type bridge setup, we've got the tail piece that anchors the strings, and we have got the bridge piece. This is a rigid piece of kit. They do sometimes collapse a bit. If you have a look along the curve at the bottom there, if that looks really flat, then it's probably worth just having a little eyeball to make sure that you've not got any stress fractures or just sort of bending of the metal, especially on real old Gibsons. They do have a tendency for that. This is supposed to be curved to match the sort of 12-inch radius curve of the fingerboard. Because this is fixed, we can adjust the 6th and the 1st and measure those, and the rest of the strings we just have to take for faith that they are working out. If they're not, then you may need a little bit more remedial work doing that's a little bit outside the scope of what we are looking at here. But bear in mind, you can adjust the bridge to get the action the way you want it, not the way the figures say it has to be. And the way that this works is that this is a little thumb wheel. It's got little serrations around the edge so you can grip it. It's on a threaded stud, and as you turn it clockwise, it winds down and allows the bridge to go lower, and as you turn it anti-clockwise or counterclockwise, it goes up the stud and lifts the bridge up. And that's how we make the adjustments. You will probably be better off slackening the tension on the strings just a little bit. I've seen people get pliers on these and sort of lever them round. I really hate doing that. So I prefer to do it just with a finger tension. Just slacken the strings off, it only takes a moment, and then make the adjustments, go in small amounts until you get a sort of handle of how much of a difference it makes. This guitar is pretty much where it needs to be. I'm just going to wind the the treble side down maybe about an eighth of a tone. And actually, you know, I'm not even going to do that. I'm going to leave it as it is, because for what Sam's doing, this is probably going to be about right. If he plays it and comes back and says, yep, I'd really like the action to be lower, then we can lower it. But you've got the idea of what we're doing here. Wind these down, wind them up to adjust. Check your measurements at the, where's the 12th fret? At the 12th fret. See how it compares with the standard. And if you don't know that you want anything different, tune it up, get on with it, play it, and work with it like that. If you find that you feel you're having to press the strings a long way, then maybe think about lowering a little bit. If you find out that the strings are buzzing and rattling all over the place, just raise the bridge a little bit, and, you know, go an eighth, a quarter of a turn at a time. This is hugely variable and it's really simple to do. I'll just say this again once more. With the 6th string fretted at the body fret, with a capo or a finger on the first, and coming down to the middle of the neck, just check your neck relief like we did in the last video. If you are having real problems, if you sight down the neck like this, you'll sometimes find that you can actually see a twist in it. Now, some fangled guitars actually have deliberately twisted necks so that the angle of your wrist as you're coming up and down the neck is followed by the neck. They are very odd to see. That's the basis of adjusting a Gibson with a stop tailpiece and a bridge and a separate bridge. So let's just have a quick look at some cases where that might be different. Okay, here is the beloved Strat, and the way the adjustments are made here is that each of these saddles put the appropriate hex key into here, and same thing, if you turn it clockwise, it's going to kind of push a threaded grub screw down against the plate and raise the saddle. Counterclockwise, it's going to lower it. And what we need to do here, because Strats are so much fun to work on, we've got 2 of these for each saddle, so we can rock the saddle that way, and that way we can really want these saddles to be parallel with the plate. And we need to adjust these not just on the 1st and 6th strings, but on all the middle ones, so that the curve that we have there is going to follow the curve that we have there across the neck. Now, the frets on my guitar are very slightly, I don't know if you can see there, but they are a little tiny bit flatter in the middle and the outside edge. So although this is a vintage curved neck, my neck radius is actually set by my frets, not by my fingerboard. So it's really just a matter of getting in there, setting it up, play with it, do it, play it, do it, play it, do it, and eventually you get to the point where you think, that's it, that's just right, and leave it well alone. So that's doing it on a Strat. Same thing again, slacken off the tension. Those are tiny little threaded bits of metal, and you don't want to be putting huge amounts of stress on them and risk doing any damage. So that's the joy that is setting up a Strat action. This is the Tele. Same sort of principle applies, except that because this is the vintage style bridge, it only has 3 saddles. You're actually setting the screws on either side of this. That angle actually becomes part of adjusting for the radius of the neck. And again, this is a vintage radius, and this time the frets just kind of follow it. So the bridge there, it's always going to be compromised with the Tele. You can't get them to intonate quite properly. You can't get them to follow the fingerboard absolutely correctly, and they are wonderful for it. Okay, that's the same principle on the Tele. And the other one to have a quick look at is, yeah, I know, let's choose a black guitar with a black bridge on it. So this is a Floyd setup. This is actually a Jackson licensed Floyd. We have got a stud mount, so the whole thing pivots about these 2 points here, and we wind these in or out to lower or heighten the action. And similar sort of setup in its own way to what the Gibson does, in that the setup of these saddles is on a fixed curve, and we simply adjust the inner and outer to get it right there. And you may, of course, have something with a big B or a vibrola on it. If you do, it's your own fault, and you're going to have to sort that one out yourselves. Okay, and there you go. The actual adjustments are really not that difficult. Most guitars are set up to make it easy to do. And as long as you've got a notion of what you're aiming for, you should be okay doing this. Do bear in mind that when you're deciding how high or low to go, the tolerance that you have for string rattle and string buzz is your own, and the sense of how much leverage you need to bend strings is your own. And also bear in mind that the strings that you're using make a difference, in that if you have typically heavier gauge strings, they move less when you hit them, so they don't tend to move up and down and rattle against the fret as much. If you've got lighter strings, whilst they're easier to bend, you may find that you have to move them further to get the same degree of bend, which might make a difference if you've got a low action, low frets, quite curved fingerboard. When you change old-tied strings out and put fresh ones on, it can be quite horrific how much noise you seem to get. Live with it for a couple of hours of play before you decide that it's not for you as you've got things set out. Right, I hope this is useful. If it is, as always, please do hit the thumbs up. That really helps. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the little bell so you get notified when the next thrilling installment comes out. I will see you next time out. Until then, look after yourselves. I'm Andy Picker, and I'll see you then. Bye now.